Last July, an early day motion was tabled in the House of Commons by Lynn Brown, the MP for West Ham. And that was Lynn as the constituency MP for the location of the Bryant and May Matchday Women's the factory. It's got 108 signatures to date, which makes it the 11th most signed EDM in this session of Parliament. I'm pleased to say I signed it, and I hope that Diana, you're going to confess to signing as well. That makes it one of the most popular EDMs of this session. On 8th October last year, the Bryant and May Matchwomen Strike was debated in the House of Commons, a debate again led by Lynn Brown. It was an hour-long debate, and the work of our speaker this evening, Dr. Louise was highlighted both in the EDM and in the debate. Lynn said in the debate, and I'll quote her verbatim, "I'm most grateful to Louise whose outstanding work, first published in 2009, documents in fine detail the strike and the events leading up to it. In, quote, striking a light the Bryant and May Matchwomen and their place in history, she meticulously describes the life and times of the women who worked at the match factory and the events that led 1,400 women to walk out on strike in July 1888 and stay on and strike for more than 2 weeks until the demands were met." Louise, I know, was in the public gallery on that day to hear the debate, and she was accompanied at that time by Ted Lewis, one of the descendant of one of the Matchwomen. He's not able to be with us here tonight. We hoped he would be, but he's not been able to be there. So we're delighted that Louise has agreed to come and give this talk. Apparently she became fascinated with the story of the Matchwomen strike on a trade union labour history course. Frances might have been the tutor, I don't know. She's denying it. She discovered the traditional version of events was crucially flawed, and it became her mission to bring the incredible true story of courage and solidarity to light. Louise tells me that no one was more surprised than her when she ended up doing a PhD, writing a book and organising a festival, and those Victorian East End girls are to blame for it all. So I'm sure you're all anxious to hear what Louise has got to say. Louise.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's lovely to be here tonight and to see so many of you here as well, especially those of you from Parliament, because was something happening today in Parliament? Was it? No, it would have been on the news, wouldn't it, if there'd been anything major? Yes, I was here last October, and it was amazing to hear the Bryant and May Matchwomen debated in the House of Commons. It wasn't the first time that they'd been discussed there. They actually made it to Parliament now what have I done now? See, you shouldn't leave me, Melanie, in charge of any sort of technology. There we go. They actually made it to... Yes, I know, don't worry, I was prepared for that. They actually made it to Parliament in the 1880s, which was the year of their famous strike. And that was incredible, because to have women like this in Parliament was absolutely unheard of. Normally, the sort of people you would expect to find in Parliament, like those of you here today, very respectable, you know, some of you, a few of you, the great and good of the land, but what you did not expect to find or even to hear discussed were working class women like these. They were generally dismissed in their time in the 1880s as a rough set of girls. So trust me, you would not have said that to their faces, not if you had any sense. And I'm afraid to say they were not unknown to the local magistrates of the time. And it was said that in the East End, where they lived and worked, decent folk did not care to be outdoors when they came off shift, because they didn't want to be subjected to the language, I'm afraid, and the terrible behaviour of these matchwomen. And as for how they dressed, well, we'll get on to that later, but I'm afraid it shocked the Victorian middle classes. Suffice to say, far too much Victorian bling, and far too great an absence of maidenly modesty from head to toe, and quite possibly all points in between. So how did they get here, or how did they get over the road in 1888, and why, as you may be asking yourselves, am I banging on about them today? There is a good reason. So our story begins in the East End of the 1880s, and think Ripper Street, and think Charles Dickens, and think the adaptations that you've seen on television. It was not a good time to be in the East End. There weren't many good times, to be fair, to be in the East End up until quite recently. But this was a particularly bad one. Only 6 miles from where we are today, but an entire world away from posh London. The East End at this point, or rather East London, was just starting to be called the East End. It wasn't called that before. And there's a really good reason for that. It's become a very particular kind of area. This is a typical scene of East End life. This is a family of tailors, although only the father would have been considered a military tailor. They're all working, as you can see. The children are working, even the really young kids. And you can also see the state of the room, but that there are beds. You can see in the foreground and to the side, there are beds poking out. And that's because that would have been their home. That one room would have been their entire home. That's where they lived, that's where they worked, that's where they cooked and ate and slept. And that's a very typical scene, the East End at this time. It's become a real home of what they call sweated labour, the worst, most exploitative kind of labour. Because of its geographical position, it's surrounded on 3 sides by water. It was a natural home for London's docks from the 1700s onwards. And it became a centre for immigration. And becomes a centre for the cheapest, worst kind of labour. The docks were the biggest employer of male casual labour. Now, when they say casual labour, it doesn't mean it was relaxed. It doesn't mean that it was, a bit of a laugh. The only thing casual was the employer's attitude to their employees. You had no contract of employment. You had no rights whatsoever. And by the 1880s, with the coming of the steam trains, the gentry, anyone who can afford to, moves out of the East End to the new suburbs that have grown up because of the coming of the railways. So they travel back into the East End to work, but they no longer live there. And one writer said that by the 1880s, the flight of the gentry from the East End had become complete, and that what they left behind was a monstrous hell of poverty. It was said that at points of the East End around this time, half of the children of the poor wouldn't reach their 5th birthday. Quite a damning indictment of the conditions. Living in one room like this, obviously, no matter how hard you try, it's only going to be unhealthy. It's only going to be insanitary. Quite often, people that were visiting the poor and writing about their lives would say that, as well as inevitably the noise, having babies, having somebody perhaps ill in one corner while you were trying to work as well, you might have an ex-member of the family with you as well. While you were trying to save up for the funeral and the coffin, you might perhaps have Granny in the corner for a few days as well. But this is the kind of image that you also see a lot of as working class life at this period. Big contrast to the previous one. This is what your sort of posh Victorians thought the poor were getting up to. My friends from St Albans might think this is a scene from our local pub on a Saturday night. It's not. But you can see exactly what the Victorians think about the working classes here. They're having far too much fun. They're wasting their money on booze when they shouldn't be. And I mean, look at the state of them, really. Don't they look like the worst representations of the race, which is exactly what people thought about the working classes in this age of eugenics. So this was a typical attack, really, on working class life and far away from the reality. EastEnders were thought to be the worst of the worst, the poorest of the poor, and the term EastEnder develops right here and now as an insult. It was an insult to call somebody an EastEnder. And it was said that if you had a shabby man from perhaps Battersea or one of the more respectable parts of London, they might be all right. But if you had an EastEnder across your threshold, well, look out. Reach for the bug powder, somebody said, and lock up the spoons. Disreputable types. So the Bryant and May women are EastEnders, they're working class women, and worst of all, they're also factory girls. Now this image is factory girls attacking a constable. It's a cartoon from Punch of the day. And you can see these women dressed to the nines, really rather glamorous, but out on the town for a night, somewhat drunk, and having a disagreement with the local constabulary. And again, this is how working class women of the time were seen. Another image, this one, is entitled, the caption for this is the wife in the middle saying, "I say, George, this young person appears to know you." It's an awkward moment in a marriage. George has some explaining to do. But you can also see that the girl's a flower seller as well, so she's also working. And working girl at this time becomes a euphemism for prostitute, for the very reason that women are working publicly in factories, not just doing sort of what can be seen as feminine duties on farms or in agriculture, and they're seen as a bit of a threat. And East End women that have to indulge in prostitution, well, obviously they're doing it to lure the Georges of the world, the poor, put upon, respectable Georges of the world, who only want to go home to their wives, but they're being lured into the dens of iniquity of the East End by these women. The Victorians see this as a real threat, but it's the women they see as the threat. It's the working classes that they see as the threat. It's their fault they're poor because they're not respectable and because, frankly, they don't live right, and they're bringing the rest of the race down with them. I don't know if anyone mentioned the Daily Mail. I think I heard someone say the Daily Mail, that perhaps nothing new under the sun. Funnily enough, that paper was established around that period, but I'm sure that's a complete coincidence. So, our Matchwomen have all of that against them. They're working class women, they're East Enders, and also, I'm afraid to tell you, largely guilty of being Irish. It's just unforgivable, isn't it? You'd think they wouldn't have the temerity to be Irish on top of all the rest of it. This is what Victorian Londoners thought about the Irish community in the East End. This is the eminent Victorian social chronicler, Charles Booth, writing about an area of the East End that was known as the Fenian Barracks. And he said, "Men here are not human, they are wild beasts. This block sends more police to hospital than any in London. Arrest a man or a woman, a rescue is always organised. They will throw bricks, iron, anything they can get their hands on. All are Irish cockneys, and not an Englishman nor a Scotchman will live amongst them." Quite right too. So here we go. Here's our Matchwomen, Eastenders and Irish cockneys. So really, they should have known their place, shouldn't they? They should have just done their jobs and, kept themselves quiet. But I'm afraid it didn't quite go like that. In the summer of 1888, in fact, the streets of Bow around the factory where they worked, that's the Bryant and May factory today, very posh housing, then the biggest employer of female casual labour in the East End by far. Streets all around it, in an uproar, nothing to do with Jack the Ripper yet, although it will very soon after this period. And we're told that battalions of police are being sort of bust into the area at this point as well. Police leave is pretty much cancelled throughout the country. What is it that's going on that's so appalling? The Matchwomen have only gone on strike. 1,400 of them have laid down their tools and walked out of the factory and immediately begun picketing at the gates. Now, Bryant and May had become so powerful at this time that they'd driven wages down. Wages were lower at this point than they had been 10 years previously. But Bryant and May were doing incredibly well. Their products were ubiquitous. If you thought of matches, you thought of Bryant and May. And their profits were incredible as well. The shareholders were getting 20% dividends, which is not bad, is it? Not a bad old return on your investment. But, and we know this specifically because of a journalist who exposed conditions inside the factory, Annie Besant, of whom more later, and Frank mentioned her in the beginning. She said you could see the truth of the lower wages, the fact that wages had been lowered in the last decade. If you looked at the youngest girls, and I'll go back to a picture of, these are some of the women that went on strike in 1888, and they're very young, they could have been 11 or 12, some of these girls, most of them are teenagers. And Annie Besant said that when she came to interview them, you could see by looking at them that the youngest girls, who would have been or should have been growing physically when these lower wages came into being, were really frail. And I mean, working class women of this period were not the most robust anyway, but even for their class and even for their age, they were noticeably really tiny and really frail and unhealthy looking. They were, in fact, malnourished. What made matters worse at Bryant and May, though, was that the employers also fined them rather generously from their wages. Actually, it was illegal, but a little thing like that didn't bother Bryant and May. They had friends in very high places. And one girl gave Annie Besant an example of the kind of fines. She said, well, let me give you an example. I was fined recently because one of the machines was cutting our fingers, and so I altered it. Now, I knew that I could alter it and it would still work, but it would be safer. Well, the foreman was furious when he found out, and he said to her, put it back how it was, and he fined her. And he said, the machine is worth more than you are, never mind your fingers. Well, it's a business cost analysis, isn't it? Of the kind that, perhaps we might even see today. But she said, a couple of weeks after that, one of my workmates had her fingers severed completely by this same machine. And what happened? She was sacked, and there was, of course, no compensation, no trade union in those days, so she was just out of work. Can't make matches without the correct complement of fingers, so that was that for her. But what made it worse, the most popular type of match at this period was called the Lucifer, appropriately enough. It required white phosphorus to make it. There were alternatives. There were alternative kinds of matches with a different, safer kind of phosphorus. White phosphorus caused what the women knew as phossy jaw, which they dreaded. It was the horrific industrial disease of matchmaking. And here's a poor chap who was probably a match dipper, and you can see he's completely lost his jawbone through phosphorus necrosis. What would happen was that the particles of phosphorus that were in the air would work their way into your jawbone. Probably you'd have holes in your teeth probably in those days. You wouldn't be able to afford the dentist. And they'd work their way in. They'd go straight to the jawbone, which would start to rot and decay. And I'm sorry if you just had tea, by the way. This is rather gory. But apparently the abscesses that formed, the odour was so unpleasant that even loved ones couldn't stand to be under the same roof as sufferers, which leads to great tragedies. And factory inspectors will later find women, matchmakers and men, living on the outskirts of towns and cities almost like lepers in the final stages of this horrible disease. When I was doing a talk at the Museum of London, someone told me that his grandparents had lived near the factory at this time, and they'd always told him when he was a boy, oh, you could see the matchwomen's routes home from work every day because of the piles of fluorescing vomit in the gutters, because phosphorus also makes your clothes and apparently also the contents of your stomach fluoresce. Actually banned now as a weapon of war. That's how unpleasant it is. You can't use it to kill people. Absolutely fine, though, to have the working classes handling it to make matches at this period. So this would have been, you can see from this jawbone, this is a typical jawbone of a phosphorus victim. And you can see that all the teeth have gone from one side completely, and the jawbone's completely rotted away. Really just a hideous disease, and understandably, the women dreaded it. Now, what made matters particularly bad in this one factory was that there was no separate dining room. So you would bring in your probably bit of stale bread from home that you'd have for your lunch, and you'd put it on your workbench. So by the time you came to eat it, the phosphorus particles in the air have filtered down and settled on it, so it's got a ready route into your mouth. I was saying to Melanie beforehand that when I did a talk in a school, they say never work with children, don't they? I showed this, this awful image, expecting the dear kid to be quite struck and upset by it. And one of the boys said, well, miss, you said they were poor. I said, yes, they were, terribly low wages. He said, yeah, but they must have got a lot of money from the tooth fairy, though. Never, ever again. So when the women walked out on strike, people blamed the journalist that we've mentioned, Annie Besant. She was a middle-class journalist, she was a political activist, she was a Fabian. And everyone assumed because she'd written about Bryant and May in this hard-hitting piece that I've been quoting, White Slavery in London, obviously she must have organised the strike, because a bunch of working-class girls really have been intelligent enough to go on strike on their own. They needed help, they needed to be shown the way, they needed someone to tell them they were exploited. They probably hadn't noticed at all. The interesting thing is that this traditional story has really, or had really stayed that way until into the 1890s. And that's pretty much where I came in. And I don't mean in 1888, before you ask, although sometimes it feels like I was there. I was definitely not an academic. As Frank said, I was on a trade union labour history course when I first got interested in this story, and having been involved in strikes, just really curious about the way the story was told and couldn't quite work it out. I thought it asked more questions, or as many questions than it answered. What really puzzled me was how a woman like Besant, at a time of really brutal class divides, had supposedly gone down to a factory, interviewed some of the women, and then caused the strike. So presumably said, I say, girls, I'm in the Fabian Society and we've had a vote and we've decided that you're going out on strike a week Wednesday. Is that all right? And they've all said, oh, God bless you, Mum, yes, well, absolutely, we'll be there. Now, knowing East End women, I can't imagine that the answer would have been whatever you say, Mum, given that they would have been giving up their wages, giving up their jobs. You know, they knew they could be sacked just like that by Brian to May. Didn't make sense to me. And I thought, well, let's work out how this woman did it. Perhaps I can pick up some tips. You never know. And I started looking at all the accounts from the period, thinking they must describe her tactics. They must say, well, Annie Besant had a meeting and she said this, and she said we'll have a strike fund, and she persuaded the women to go out on strike. But there was nothing in all the contemporary histories. It just said, Annie Besant wrote an article, bang, the Matchwomen went out on strike, Annie Besant led them. Well, I kept reading and studying it in a really quite disorganised way, to be honest, not in a very academic way at all. And people have said to me since, oh, it's very interesting, your methodology that you use. And I just sort of say, yeah, definitely. They say, how would you describe it? Well, it's a mixture of, you know, not knowing what you're doing and not knowing what you're doing. But there you go. I just read every account I possibly could. I read all the newspapers of the period. I read people's journals. I read all the political papers, and I tried to draw up a timeline to see what had really happened. I got more and more puzzled because Annie Besant never talks about a strike in her article. She talks about a boycott. And that was a typical practice of the time, a middle-class boycott of a particularly bad employer's product. But there's nothing about a strike. And then in the same issue of her paper, The Link, in which white slavery in London appears, there's an opinion piece by Annie Besant saying about this trade union business. Now, people are saying that these casual workers, and women as well, should be organised into trade unions. And she says, well, what a stupid idea. That would never work. As soon as they went on strike, they'd be sacked and they'd be out of a job and they'd be replaced. Because you've got a huge pool of unemployed in London and East London at this period. And you can see her point for practical reasons, but that doesn't sound like the way a strike leader would talk, unless she's being incredibly cunning and really hiding her plan of action. But I also looked in the Brian to May archives, and fortunately they'd all been given to a library in Hackney. And I also found a list the foreman had drawn up of 5 women they thought were really behind the strike. Brian to May's naughty list of reprobates and troublemakers. And obviously, if the strike was, in the opinion of the foreman, organised from inside the workplace, it couldn't have been triggered or orchestrated from the outside as well. It just doesn't make sense. So it took me a good while, about 10 years on and off. I was incredibly young when I started. I know you're thinking that. But by slowly piecing together every account I could find of the strike, I drew up a new timeline. I also traced descendants of some of the original Matchwomen, and that was by far the most exciting piece of my work. To meet people who'd actually known these women as their grandmothers was amazing, and it's such a shame that Louise couldn't be here today. So what happened, I think, was this. Brian to May read Annie Besant's article at the end of June 1888. She made sure they did. She telegraphed them to tell them, you might want to buy my paper and you might want to see an article. It might be of some interest to you. Brian to May were absolutely furious, and they started to bully the workers almost immediately. They put papers around every workroom that the women were supposed to sign underneath, saying, we absolutely love working for Brian to May. We couldn't be happier. They're the most marvellous employers. And this Annie Besant, every word she's written is a lie. But they wouldn't do it. Now, that was incredibly brave, because they knew they risked the sack and they needed their wages desperately. But every single woman refused to sign. They even delivered a note to Annie Besant's house, a handwritten note, and this is one of the few examples of what we know to be the Matchwomen's own words. And here's what they said. Dear lady, they've been trying to get the poor girls to say it is all lies that has been written and to sign a paper. We will not sign. We hope you will not get into any trouble on our behalf, as you have stood up for us, and what you have spoken is quite true. I always find that so touching that the Matchwomen were concerned about Annie Besant. You know, she stuck up for us, fair enough. We're not having anybody say she's lying. Annie Besant could look after herself, but bless them, they understood loyalty. So Brian to May next made an example of one girl who they believed was a ringleader of the strike. And all we know about her from the press of the time was she was a pale little person in black who was popular with her workmates. She was sacked on an excuse All the other workers knew why she'd really been sacked, and they all streamed out of the gates of that factory on the Bow Road behind her. Now, instead of doing what the middle classes and the media at the time might have expected of working class people who'd walked out of work, go down the pub, or down the music hall, or just sort of wander off home confusedly, in fact, they got tactical almost immediately. They assembled a picket line at the gates, and they also elected, in a very democratic way, 6 women to go back inside and put their terms to Bryant May. And I think that the women in this picture, those 6 women are among them, and that's why these are the ones that have been photographed here. And this is right outside the factory gates of Bryant May. So Bryant May hear their terms, which include the reinstatement of this sacked girl, an end to the fines, and a proper dining room away from the phosphorus fumes, so they knew very well what was causing phossy jaw. Bryant May responded by threatening the strikers with dismissal en masse unless they went back immediately, but they wouldn't go back. Now, over 1,000 women, 1,400 women, and some men and boys as well, are demonstrating around the streets of Bow, singing, I'm afraid to have to tell you, rather rude songs about their employers, because there's a lovely little bit of oral history in the British Library about this song they sung, which I'm far too polite to repeat to you now. But the only person who's nowhere to be seen is our Annie Besant, not on the scene. And she would have been mentioned in the local papers because she was quite the celebrity socialist. She was very well known at the time. And I found out why eventually from her own journal. And she said she was working in her offices in Fleet Street, and there was a bit of a ruckus down below, and she looked out of the window, and there were all these women, sort of raggedy band of women downstairs. And her concern was that she didn't know who they were or why they were there, but they were blocking the pavement, and respectable people, wanted to get past. And she was sent down a note asking would they please move, and who were they? She then saw 3 of the women. She had them up to tea, and she said they were really quite respectable. And she asked them why they'd come. They told her they were on strike. Now, that's a very sloppy strike leader who doesn't even know that a strike's begun. She wasn't even monitoring events at the factory, let alone directing them. Now, she never claimed otherwise. This isn't a Besant bashing exercise at all. She didn't want the title of strike leader. She actively rejected it. She wrote letters to the Times around this period. She gave the strike excellent publicity, but she constantly says it's absolutely false to say that I started the strike. I was nowhere near the factory when it began. It wasn't me, Gov, basically. And she says this over and over again. She also says that she thinks striking is a mistake. She says in her next issue of the paper, the girls will go back to work. Actually, the girls wouldn't go back to work and didn't, but she was really keen. You can understand that because 1,400 desperately poor women on the streets of the East End with no financial means of support, from a practical point of view, yes, it's worrying, but she certainly wasn't celebrating the fact that they'd gone on strike. This begins to really attract a lot of press attention. It's in the East End, near enough to the Houses of Parliament to cause trouble, and at a time when people thought that social revolution was a real possibility. So it starts picking up a lot of press attention, and it starts to be called the Matchgirls Strike. The women went several days without work, but the journalists were quite surprised because a lot of journalists wouldn't probably have met working class women, not this working class anyway. And they were quite surprised, and they're quite curious. They're saying, this is extraordinary women, the clothes they wear, you should see them. They wear these sort of skirts with patches on as if it was a fashion. and their boots are they really need a polish. Well, yes, they are poor. But they were quite amazed to find them sticking up for each other, because the image of the poor is completely mindless, completely selfish, just out for themselves, no political intelligence whatsoever. And they say, no, it's not true. You can hear them saying to each other, well, I can pawn that for you, or I can lend you that, or we can give you a meal, and all helping each other on while they try to raise funds for the strike. The working class was so cut off, the East End working class was so cut off from London that at this point, when the Matchwomen do march to Parliament, not on Parliament, I have to say, but to Parliament, because it's quite a difference, but it causes absolute uproar. It literally stops the traffic. The sight of poor working class women in posh bits of London is absolutely shocking. They get catcalls apparently and quite a lot of abuse from passers-by, but they hold their heads high and they impress the MPs they meet with to talk about their lives, and I think surprise them as well a bit by their eloquence and the honest stories that they tell about the difficulties of their lives. And it's really because of that that political pressure begins to grow on Bryant and May. A lot of shareholders are MPs and clergymen, and it all gets a bit embarrassing when in their day jobs they're defending the poor, and then they're being exposed as having these shares and getting paid these massive dividends. So Bryant and May are eventually forced into a climb down, incredibly reluctant. They didn't take it well. It has to be said, it wasn't done with a good grace at all. There's letters in their archives years later saying, don't talk to us about that strike. It's completely unreasonable. There was no need for it whatsoever. Really bitter, I have to say. But they had to concede. They had no choice. Their share price was tumbling. And in 2 weeks, these women, unorganised with no trade union, had won better rates of pay, an end to those fines, a separate dining room, and the right to form what became the largest union of women and girls in the country at the time. It's a remarkable victory, but it's more remarkable, I think, that historians have continued to portray them, even after that, as this helpless bunch of girlies who really didn't know what they were doing, and thank goodness Annie Besant was there to tell them what to do and show them the way. A year later, there was a huge dock strike in the same part of London, and that has always been considered incredibly important. The fact that the Matchwomen strike happened a year before it's rather interesting the way that gets explained away. Well, it was sort of before, but it was just a sort of sign of what was coming. It didn't influence anybody at all. It couldn't have influenced anybody because, they were women and the dockers were men, and so how could they? Literally, I'm not really exaggerating very much there. Really quite surprised me when I started looking at the research, or the lack of research, into the connection between the two strikes. So through several years of research, I had the pleasure of making the acquaintance of the Matchwomen through the pages of history. And I found that they were not ignorant factory girls, not slum lasses or helpless waifs, and certainly no one's poor little match girl, that's for sure. This picture features the same women as the first picture we've just been looking at, but you wouldn't really know it. They're a lot more glammed up here, and they look like very different women. They're far more confident. This is actually their strike committee. It's Annie Besant in the pale dress at the lectern, and next to her, because people ask me, it's not a very butch match woman, it's Herbert Burrows of the Fabian Society. That's the guy with the moustache. Everyone else is female. And this was much later in the strike. You can see their confidence increasing. The first picture, they've just walked out on strike. They don't know what they're going to do. They're tired. They've been up since 5 a.m, and they're quite worried about what the future holds. But here, hey, we've been in the papers and we've met with MPs and we're really doing rather well. And you can see the confidence. They would also, I think, have got their best dresses probably out of the pawn shop, because you would have to usually pawn your best stuff when your wages ran out and then get them out again when you got paid. And they've had their hair done, and they really look, I think, rather glam, don't they? And these were the Matchwomen that were known and not, I'm afraid, really approved of by the middle classes. It was said that before the strike they were well known. You could spot a Matchwoman by the freedom of her walk, the number of her friends, and the shrillness of her laugh. Tut-tut. You would also notice her bright clothes. If she wasn't heard, and she generally would be heard, she could be seen. They favoured really bright clothes, which was not how the poor were supposed to dress. I mean, a bit of beige, for goodness sake. But no, bright clothes, fringed hairstyles that we can see in this shot, little high-heeled boots, and hats. They loved their hats, did the Matchwomen. Because they couldn't afford to buy their own on their wages, they paid into what they called feather clubs. They had communal hat-buying clubs, and they'd contribute a penny a week or whatever they could afford. When they had enough, Elsie would go down and buy a hat from the milliners. But again, would she go for a nice, modest little bonnet? No, I'm afraid not. The biggest hats they could possibly get with the brightest and the biggest feathers. It really, really wouldn't do. Really wasn't on. One popular resident, I found a lovely bit of history when I was looking through someone's archives, remembered not just the hats, but the hat pins. Big hat pin sounds a bit like a euphemism, but it isn't. And he said, these match girls were very tough, and on rare occasions when in any trouble, they didn't hesitate to use these horrible long hat pins to defend themselves. So dressed to kill, very literally. I found, when I was really late into my research, a really interesting bit in the Daily News, which suggested that the Matchwomen might even have upset Jack the Ripper, which is quite impressive. Intimation was given to the city police on Saturday morning that Messrs Bryant and May received a letter from a person signing himself J. Ripper, couched in the following terms. I hereby notify that I'm going to pay your girls a visit. I hear they are beginning to say what they will do with me. I'm going to see what a few of them have in their stomachs, how delightful, and I will take it out of them. Signed, John Ripper, not Jack, but John Ripper. Well, probably a hoax, but what's so interesting about it is that the chap is saying these matchwomen are going around like vigilantes. They're not scared, like most people quite understandably were. At this time, 5 women have died in the East End, have been murdered. But they're not terrified. They're saying, wait till we get our hands on that expletive deleted. And, you know, they're threatening the Ripper himself. I mean, there was probably an element of bravado. I mean, there can't have been many women hoping to bump into Jack the Ripper down a back alley at this point. No matchwomen ever did fall victim to Jack the Ripper, as far as we know. But I do think it's a shame that a gang of them with their hat pins at the ready didn't come across him one night down a Whitechapel back alley. The local magistrate that I mentioned earlier said that when they came back from nights out, you always knew it was the matchwomen because you could hear choruses of all the music hall songs of the day, so, you know, shattering the peace of the night. Tarara Bundier and Knocked 'em in the Old Kent Road were their favourites, apparently. They seem to know by heart the words of all the popular music hall songs of the day, he says, sounding rather tired as he writes. Another commentator said these matchwomen are insolent. They have an insolent confidence, but also they're very loyal to each other. When a girl is out of work, they stick together. That was really key. Connections with the dockers were everywhere as well. Even before I interviewed descendants of Matchgirls families, I'd found from the census that matchwomen and dockers were not, as some historians have said, completely separate groups. They were in the same streets, in the same houses, in the same families. You can't get much closer than that. In fact, one commentator said matchgirls and dockers tend to marry each other, they tend to date each other. Well, they would. They're both Irish community and they're both casual labourers in the East End at this period. It would be really surprising if the one victory hadn't influenced the other strike. When the dockers went on strike, I found that the matchwomen struck as well. Secondary action, can't do that anymore, can you? And during the victory procession of the dock strike, the Star newspaper gives us a glimpse of some familiar faces. They said, up came the dockers, then a large contingent of women, matchmakers among others, advancing like a moving rainbow, for they all wear the huge hats and feathers of many colours they love to sport when on a day out. I do love the idea of a strike demonstration as a bit of a day out and get your best hat on for it, and why not? They also went on to recruit other working women, and their recruitment meetings were a bit of a party, really. There was a lot of tea and cake going down, a bit of Irish dancing, and why not? And that was the spirit that I really looked at when I was organising the festival last year to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the strike. It was a bit of a knees up, I'm glad to say, and we did have Irish music and tea and cake and beer and curry. And I was delighted that 700 people came, including the late lamented Bob Crow. And I was pleased to introduce, let's embarrass her again, Frances O'Grady, the first female General Secretary of the TUC, and also from a good Irish family, and proof that you just can't keep a good Irish woman down. So the matchwomen were incredible. They completely confounded the judgment of their betters. They broke every convention of respectable Victorian female behaviour. They changed history forever for working people. Without them, we wouldn't have had the workers' rights we have today, but the rights that we're also fighting so desperately to maintain. And it is a fight. The press does like to talk about health and safety gone mad, but don't be fooled by that. Because of the scrapping of regulations and enforcement, workers and the public are at greater risk now than they have been for decades, actually, from industrial accidents. And in this country, almost the entire strike force of Bryant and May, which was 1,400 women, is killed every year at work. 1,300 men and women die every year at work, but you may well not read about it in the papers. In fact, Frank was talking about the debate in Parliament last October, and actually on the 8th of October, a young building worker died in East London, Daniel Yowell, who was working on a building site at a primary school. We shouldn't forget him and those like him, and we shouldn't forget the spirit of the matchwomen and what they were fighting for. They weren't just stroppy Irish girls, though there's nothing wrong with that. They changed the world for the better when it really needed to be changed. And they'd be livid if they thought all of that had been for nothing. And I think I've proved you don't want to upset a matchwoman. So let's remember. Thank you.